The 32nd floor of Hargrove and Weld Financial Partners had a particular kind of silence, the kind that wasn't really silent at all, but filled with the low hum of servers, the click of expensive heels on marble, and the practiced laughter of people who had learned that cruelty was just another form of networking. Ivy Calloway didn't belong there. Everyone made sure she knew it. She had earned her CPA at 23, finished in the top 2% of her cohort at Indiana University, and spent the last 4 years building risk models that had quietly saved Hargrove and Weld from 3 separate regulatory disasters that senior partners had taken full credit for fixing. She knew this. She had the emails to prove it, saved in a folder on her personal hard drive labeled Rainy Day, because Ivy Calloway had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, and she had learned early that rainy days always came. What she couldn't model, what no spreadsheet had ever prepared her for, was walking into the break room on a Tuesday morning and hearing Serena Voss, VP of Client Relations, Yale Law, size 4, never let anyone forget any of it, say clear as a bell, "I just think it's unprofessional. If you can't control what goes in your mouth, how can we trust you to control a client portfolio?" The laughter that followed was soft, practiced, the kind that meant everyone in that room had done the math on who mattered and who didn't. Ivy had stopped in the doorway with her coffee mug in her hand. She hadn't said a word. She had turned around, walked back to her desk, and spent the next 40 minutes cross-referencing a Basel III compliance report with the focus and quiet fury of someone who had survived things that would have broken half the people in that office before lunch. She did not cry. She hadn't cried at work in 4 years, and she wasn't about to start now. What she did do 3 hours later was pull up an anomaly that had been sitting in the flagged transactions queue for 11 days. Flagged, ignored, bounced between departments like nobody wanted to be the one to open it. A shell account registered in the Cayman Islands had been funneling recurring transfers through a Hargrove and Weld managed trust in increments just small enough to avoid automatic FINRA reporting thresholds. 11 days, 3 different senior analysts had looked at it and decided it was someone else's problem. Ivy looked at it for 4 minutes, pulled the last 18 months of associated transaction records, and understood immediately that it was everyone's problem. The account belonged, at the end of a very long and deliberately complicated chain, to a holding company called Meridian Vance Group. On paper, Meridian Vance Group was a real estate development firm with offices in Chicago, Miami, and Las Vegas. Off paper, which is to say, on the kind of paper that only existed in federal databases and the very careful memories of organized crime task forces, Meridian Vance was the financial infrastructure of the Rourke operation. Ivy did not know that last part. Not yet. What she knew was that the numbers didn't add up. The structure was textbook layering, and somebody at Hargrove and Weld had either been extraordinarily negligent or extraordinarily complicit. She flagged it to her direct supervisor, Preston Albright, at 2:15 in the afternoon. Preston was 61 years old, had been at the firm for 22 years, played golf with 3 of the 7 partners, and looked at Ivy the way people look at a smoke alarm going off when they're already running late. "I'll look into it," he said, which she knew meant he wouldn't. "Preston." She kept her voice even. "This has money laundering indicators across at least 6 of the 9 FTF typologies. If this gets to a regulator before we self-report," I said, "I'll look into it, Ivy." He had already turned back to his monitor. "You can go," she went. She sat at her desk and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She did not have to think long, because 40 minutes later, Preston appeared at her cubicle with a look on his face that she had never seen before, not annoyed, not dismissive. Something worse. Scared. "A meeting's been called," he said. "Conference room B. Senior partners want to talk to you." Senior partners did not talk to Ivy Calloway, not directly, not ever. She followed Preston down the hall with her laptop under her arm. And when she walked into conference room B, she found not 3 senior partners but 5, and a man she had never seen before, sitting at the head of the table like he owned it. He probably owned several things far larger than it. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that people either inherited from old money or from learning a long time ago that they were the most dangerous person in any room they entered. His suit was charcoal and impeccably cut, and he wore no tie. There was a single folder in front of him that he had not opened. He did not need to open it. He already knew what was in it. His name, she would learn later, was Ronan Voss. No relation to Serena, or perhaps distant relation, the kind neither branch of the family bothered to claim. He was the kind of name that existed in financial circles as a rumor first and a fact second. The man behind Meridian Vance, behind 6 other holding structures, behind a network of legitimate businesses that did, in fact, generate legitimate revenue, and also behind the kind of operations that federal prosecutors spent entire careers trying to pin down and never quite managed. He looked at Ivy Calloway when she walked through the door, and he did not look away. "Mrs. Calloway," said Howard Hargrove, the eldest partner, from somewhere to her left. His voice was the voice of a man delivering a prepared statement. "It's come to our attention that you accessed a restricted client file this afternoon without authorization." Ivy set her laptop on the table. The file wasn't marked restricted. It was in the general compliance queue. It has since been reclassified. "Since I flagged it to Preston, you mean?" She looked at Preston, who was looking at the table. 2 hours ago, regardless of the timeline, Howard continued, the client in question has raised serious concerns about a breach of confidentiality. We take those concerns very seriously. The client, Ivy said carefully, is a shell company in the Caymans. Nobody spoke. The man at the head of the table, Ronan Voss, leaned back slightly in his chair. He was watching her the way she imagined a chess player watches the board 3 moves before a checkmate. "Miss Calloway," Howard said, "given the sensitive nature of this situation, we think it's best if you take a leave of absence while we conduct an internal review." There it was. She had heard those words before. She had watched them happen to other people. She knew exactly what internal review meant. It meant they needed time to decide how to make her disappear without the paperwork becoming a problem. "You're asking me to leave," she said. "We're asking you to cooperate. And if I don't?" She asked it genuinely curious, because she had already done the math on this, and she wanted to see if they had. Howard glanced at the man at the head of the table, just for a half second. But Ivy caught it. "Miss Calloway," Ronan Voss said, and his voice was the first time he had spoken, low and unhurried, with a faint accent she couldn't quite place. "Why don't you sit down?" "It wasn't a question." She sat down. "You flagged a transaction anomaly. That was your job, and you did it. The question of what happens next is more complicated than your compliance training covered." He looked at her with an expression that was not unkind and not particularly warm, simply direct, the way very few people were direct with her, as though he had assessed her in the 30 seconds since she'd entered the room and decided she could handle straight talk. "You're not in trouble, but you may be in danger, and that's a different conversation." The partners in the room had gone very quiet. Ivy noticed, with the part of her brain that never stopped noticing things, that none of them looked surprised by what he had just said. "What kind of danger?" she asked. "The kind that happens when a person knows something that other people would prefer remained unknown." He finally opened the folder. "The account you flagged. You traced it back to Meridian Vance, to a holding company associated with Meridian Vance. How far did you get?" She looked at him, far enough to understand it was layering, not far enough to identify the source funds, but you could, given time and access. It wasn't a question either. He said it the way people state facts they've already verified. "Yes," she said, "probably." Something shifted in his expression. She didn't know what to call it. Not admiration, something quieter, like a recalibration. "The people who own the source funds," he said, "are aware that someone at this firm noticed the anomaly. They have been made aware of your name." The room felt colder. "That's not my problem," she said, because it was the bravest thing she could think of to say, even though every rational part of her knew it absolutely was. "It is now," Ronan Voss said. He closed the folder. "I'm going to make you a proposal, Miss Calloway, and I'd like you to hear it in full before you respond." She should have said no. She should have stood up, walked out, called the FBI's financial crimes tip line from her cell phone in the elevator and never looked back. She stayed. Later she would tell herself it was because she'd understood even then that walking out of that conference room was the more dangerous option. That was true. But it wasn't the only reason. The proposal was this. Ronan Voss had, over the course of several years, been systematically building a case against the Callaghan Syndicate, the organization that operated through Meridian Vance and 17 other structures with the intention of dismantling it from the inside. He had his own reasons. He didn't share them then. What he shared was this. The case required a forensic financial analyst who could reconstruct the full money trail, document it in a way that would survive federal court, and do so quietly and quickly before the syndicate's people identified and neutralized the threat. "I have analysts," he said. "Then use them. They've been looking at this for 8 months. You found the thread in 4 minutes." He looked at her steadily. "I need the best, Miss Calloway, not the most convenient." Nobody had ever said that to her before, not like that. She asked for 24 hours to think about it. He gave her 12, said it with an apology that seemed genuine, and explained that the people who knew her name were not patient. She spent those 12 hours in her apartment in Wicker Park, eating leftover Thai food and running calculations on her kitchen table. Not financial calculations, probability calculations. The likelihood that refusing meant witness intimidation, the likelihood that accepting meant something worse. The likelihood that she had, in the course of one Tuesday, stepped into something that her salary, her compliance certifications, and her very carefully maintained professional distance from anything interesting had completely failed to prepare her for. At 4 in the morning, she called the number Ronan Voss had written on the back of a business card and said, "I have conditions." "Tell me," he said. He sounded awake. "I keep copies of everything. Time-stamped, encrypted, with instructions to release to 3 separate federal agencies if I go missing or if my access gets cut. Reasonable. I work independently. I don't share methodology with your people until the final documentation is ready." Agreed. "And when this is over, Hargrove and Weld gets reported to FINRA, regardless of what your arrangement with them is." Silence. "Then that one's going to cost me a business relationship I find useful." "I know." Another silence. "Agreed," he said. She showed up the next morning, not to Hargrove and Weld, which she was formally on leave from, but to an address on West Erie Street that turned out to be a private equity office so aggressively normal-looking that it was almost funny. Clean lines, expensive coffee, 3 people who greeted her by name and asked no questions. Ronan Voss was not there that morning or the morning after that. She worked. She was very good at working. She was given access to a server she understood immediately represented a criminal enterprise's financial infrastructure laid bare. Every account, every transfer, every ghost company and numbered trust and charitable front organization that the Callaghan Syndicate had used to move money for 11 years. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. The structure was almost elegant. Someone had designed it with genuine intelligence. She started dismantling it on a Wednesday. By Friday, she had reconstructed the first 4 layers. By the following Tuesday, she had mapped the primary flow channels. She was working 17-hour days and eating delivery food and barely sleeping, and she had never in her career felt more completely, uncomplicatedly useful. Ronan appeared on the 8th day. He came in at 7 in the evening when everyone else had gone and sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and said nothing for a moment, just looked at what was on her screens. "You're ahead of schedule," he said. "Your people built an 8-month timeline on this," she said, not looking up. "They were working chronologically. That's the wrong approach for layered structures. You have to map the exit points first and work backward." "Why?" She looked up then. "Because the money always knows where it's going. Follow the destination, not the origin. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nobody explained it like that before." "Did you ask?" He almost smiled. "No." They sat in that office for 2 more hours, and he asked questions. Real questions, not the kind people asked when they wanted to seem engaged, but the kind that meant he was genuinely trying to understand. She answered them. She had spent 4 years at Hargrove and Weld, being careful not to explain things too thoroughly because it made people feel inferior. And she had gotten so good at dimming herself down that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to turn the lights on. It felt like this, apparently. She didn't examine that thought too carefully. What she did examine, 3 days later, was a data irregularity that stopped her cold at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. A set of transfers she'd been tracing back to a Callahan-controlled account had a secondary routing she hadn't seen before, a ghost channel buried 4 layers deep that led not to a Callahan asset but to a separate account that had been making regular payments to a name she recognized. Preston Albright, her supervisor, her former supervisor, the man who had looked at her on a Tuesday afternoon like she was a smoke alarm going off at an inconvenient moment. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she pulled every transaction associated with Preston Albright's name, cross-referenced it against the Hargrove and Weld internal access logs she'd copied before going on leave, and understood with the particular cold clarity of someone whose rainy day folder was about to earn its name, that Preston hadn't just ignored her flag because he was lazy. He had ignored it because he had been paid to ignore it for 3 years, and he had given her name to the Callahans within 40 minutes of her leaving his office. She called Ronan at midnight. He answered on the second ring. "I found your inside source," she said. "The one who tipped them off about me, a beat. Send me what you have. I'm sending it now. But there's something else." She had been thinking about how to say this for 20 minutes. "If Preston has been their contact at Hargrove and Weld, he knows what I was working on before I left. He knows I found the Meridian Vance thread. And if he knows that, he's told them you're still looking. Yes. And they'll know you didn't stop at the compliance flag. Yes." The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that meant he was moving fast through a set of calculations she couldn't see. "Where are you right now? The office?" "Don't go home tonight." His voice had changed, not softer, but more focused, the way a current changes when a river narrows. "I'll have someone there in 15 minutes. I can take care of. Ivy." It was the first time he had used her first name. "Don't go home tonight." She didn't argue. She stayed at her screens and kept working, because it was the only thing she knew how to do with fear. Put it somewhere productive and keep moving. The someone he sent was a quiet, serious woman named Adele, who drove a car with plates Ivy didn't recognize and asked no questions, and took her to a hotel in River North, where there was already a keycard waiting under a name that wasn't hers. Ronan arrived 2 hours later. He sat down in the hotel room's single armchair, looked at the files she'd already transferred to her laptop, and kept right on working through, and said, "How long to finish?" "The full documentation, audit ready. 3 days. Maybe 4. You have 2. She looked up. "Then I need the access logs for the Miami accounts. I've been working around a gap." He pulled out his phone, made a call in 40 seconds, said 4 words she didn't catch, and put the phone away. "You'll have them in an hour." She had them in 40 minutes. She worked through the night. Ronan stayed. She didn't ask him to and didn't tell him to leave, and he seemed to understand, in the way he seemed to understand most things, that his presence was neither intrusive nor necessary. Simply there, a particular kind of stillness in the corner of the room, while she rebuilt the financial architecture of a criminal empire piece by piece in order to hand it to the people who would take it apart. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, she said, without looking up, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She thought about it. Someone who uses people and knows how to make it feel like something else. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been that. I'm not interested in being that anymore." She looked up then. He was watching her with an expression she recognized, because she'd felt it herself. The specific look of someone who is surprised to find they've said something true. She went back to her screens. On the second morning, 40 minutes before the documentation package was complete, the door to the hotel room opened. Not Adele, not anyone she recognized. Two men, moving with the particular economy of people who had done this before, who had come through a staff entrance and a hallway camera that had apparently gone dark sometime in the last 2 hours. Ronan was on his feet before she had fully processed what was happening. She registered it afterward, in the strange, slowed-down way that adrenaline documents events. The fact that he had moved between her and the door without thinking about it, without calculating, without the half-second of self-interest that she'd always assumed, preceded every decision a man like him made. What followed was not a long confrontation. Ronan made a phone call, one sentence, a room number, and 3 minutes later there were 4 more people in the hallway, and the 2 men were not a problem anymore. He came back to her then. She was still sitting at the table. Her hands were steady. She was not going to pretend that was entirely due to courage. It was also due to the fact that she was in a state of shock so pure it felt like very deep calm. "Are you hurt?" he asked. No. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You didn't run. My laptop was on the table." He looked at her laptop, then back at her, and this time he did smile. Fully, briefly, like something that surprised him. Of course, she closed the documentation package at 7:42 that morning. Full audit trail, source verification for every transaction, 314 pages of forensic financial evidence, reconstructing 11 years of the Callahan Syndicate's money movement. Organized by account, by entity, by individual, cross-indexed for federal court standards. She had never done her best work. She had always done very good work and kept something in reserve, the way you keep money in a rainy day folder, because she had learned that showing your full capacity was an invitation for people to take it from you. She spent those 2 days showing everything she had. She sent the package simultaneously to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, with a cover document explaining the chain of custody for every piece of evidence and a personal declaration she had already had notarized 3 days prior. She also sent a separate package to FINRA's Enforcement Division regarding Hargrove and Weld, Preston Albright's documented payments, and the firm's 11-day failure to act on a flagged transaction, which she had, as promised, kept a time-stamped copy of. Ronan watched her send them. He did not try to stop her. He had given his word, and she was beginning to understand that this was not a minor thing. When the confirmations came through, she sat back in the chair and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like she had taken up the exact right amount of space in the world. "What happens now?" she asked. For the Callahans, a great deal of legal difficulty. He was looking at the confirmation emails over her shoulder. For Hargrove and Weld, the same. For Preston, prosecution. The evidence you've documented is comprehensive. For me. He moved around the table and sat across from her, not the way he'd been sitting all night, at a distance, but closer, as though the morning had shifted something between them that he was willing to acknowledge. "What do you want to happen for you?" Nobody asked her that either. Not like that. She thought about it honestly. "I want a job where they actually use me. I have a compliance infrastructure that's been held together with inadequate oversight for 3 years, he said. I've been looking for someone who could rebuild it from the bottom up. Someone who understands that the best time to find a structural problem is before it becomes a catastrophe. That sounds like a job description." "It is." She looked at him for a moment. "You're offering me a job. I'm telling you I need the best, not the most convenient." He said it exactly the way he'd said it the first time, in the conference room, and she understood that he had thought about whether to say it that way. "The decision is yours." She thought about Serena Voss in the break room on a Tuesday morning. She thought about Preston's face when he'd come to tell her about the meeting, that specific scared look, the look of someone who had underestimated her and was only just understanding the full cost of that. She thought about 4 years of making herself smaller, 4 years of the rainy day folder, 4 years of being absolutely certain that if she was quiet enough and thorough enough and careful enough, eventually the right people would notice. The right people, it turned out, were not the ones she'd been waiting for. "Send me the formal offer," she said. "I'll need it in writing. I'd expect nothing less." He stood. "There's also the matter of this morning." She met his eyes. "The matter of 2 men coming through a hotel door, the matter of me." He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "The matter of how I responded to that." She had thought about it. She would keep thinking about it. "You moved first," she said. "You didn't calculate." "No, why?" He looked at her with the directness that had characterized every honest thing he'd said to her, which was, she realized, almost everything. "Because some things you don't calculate." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Send me the offer," she said, "in writing." He nodded. At the door he turned back. "The job. It comes with an office, on whatever floor you prefer." "Ground floor," she said. "I've had enough of heights." He laughed. It was a real laugh. Not performed, not polished. Just a sudden, unguarded sound in a hotel room in River North at 8 in the morning, and it changed his face entirely. She watched him go. Then she opened a new folder on her laptop, labeled it Next Chapter, and started making a list. 3 weeks later, the Callahan Syndicate's primary accounts were frozen pending federal indictment. Preston Albright was arrested on a Thursday morning at the Hargrove and Weld offices, in front of the entire 32nd floor. The arrest was by all accounts witnessed by Serena Voss, who had been standing near the elevator with her coffee and her practiced laughter and her size 4 suit, and who had for once nothing to say. Ivy Calloway was not there to see it. She was 4 miles away, in a corner office on the 3rd floor of a building on West Kinsey Street. Not the ground floor, she had reconsidered, rebuilding a compliance infrastructure from the bottom up, with the particular focused energy of someone who had finally stopped making herself small and discovered that the space she actually occupied was something else entirely. Ronan stopped by at noon with coffee. He knocked first. He always knocked first, she was learning, which was not something she would have predicted about him, but which turned out to be, like many things about him, more deliberate than it appeared. He asked. She looked up from her screens. "Ask me in 3 weeks. I'll be here in 3 weeks." She knew. She was starting to understand that when Ronvod said something, he meant it with the full weight of a man who had spent a very long time understanding exactly what his word was worth, and who had decided, at some point she hadn't witnessed, that it was worth keeping. "I know," she said, and went back to work.